I've just finished filming this video and thinking about how it kind of goes off the rails pretty quickly. So I want to just give you an idea of what this video is about before we get started so that you have context for my nonsense. I've been thinking a lot recently about how genres are blending together, and there are a lot of new subgenres being named and being put into the spotlight, and how are bookstores going to adapt to that? Or should they adapt to that? Or will they ever adapt to that? The example I want to use in this video is the Romantasy genre, because I think it is the biggest new genre of recent time that bookstores haven't really embraced yet. So with this context, here's the video. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. I decided to make another video. For today's video, I wanted to pose a question that I've had that I actually don't have the answer to. Usually when I do these videos of like, is this thing this? I give my opinion, and I have opinions on this question, but there's no definite answer. So let's just have a little chat about it. I changed the camera angle a bunch of times already, and I'm gonna change it again. Don't be alarmed. The question that I want to pose to you today is, should Romantasy be taken more seriously by bookstores? Romantasy is a portmanteau, which just means smushed together version of the words romance and fantasy. Romantasy. The genre is also called romantic fantasy, but that's just too much. So instead we call it Romantasy. Basically, it's just if you were to write a romance novel where the main focus of a novel is romance, but instead of setting it in the real world or a contemporary setting, you're setting it in a made-up fantasy land, or at least with strong elements of fantasy. It's a relatively new term, but it has come in very handy because it's replaced a lot of misconceptions about certain books, like what dark fantasy is. For a long time, books that were considered dark fantasy were actually just romantasy, but people didn't know what to call it. So they were like, it's dark fantasy because they have sex. And it's also replacing a lot of paranormal romance, which does not mean having sex with ghosts, which is what I thought it meant for a very long time. It just means that the romantic interests are not necessarily human. They're monsters, like werewolves and vampires and stuff. Twilight is a paranormal romance. So by now, Romantasy is a well-established genre, so why am I even asking about like, should bookstores take it more seriously? Well, as you know, or maybe you don't know, I work in a chain bookstore, a mainstream bookstore here in Canada, and we have very defined sections to the store, not just in mine, but in all of them across the nation, that fall very in line with the sections at Barnes & Noble in America and Waterstones in the UK, and most other big bookstore chains in the world. And I get it, it makes sense that we have these insane divisions on genres because it helps with shoppability. It helps customers find what they're looking for. If they are coming in looking for a specific book, they probably know what genre it is and where to start looking. Or if they come in not knowing what book they want, but the general vibes, they also know what section to start looking in. But new genres or new crossovers between genres are developing all the time. I just made a whole video about weird fiction and how it's different from horror. Yet all the weird fiction that we have in our store are put in either horror or science fiction, and that's the end of that. I'm not advocating for a weird fiction section in my store, although I would love that. That genre maybe is a little too small, maybe not quite mainstream enough to warrant its own section. But Romantasy, on the other hand, is pretty darn popular. Now, perhaps you're sitting there saying, Jules, I still don't get it. I don't know what romantic fantasy is. What is Romantasy? I will say to you, have you ever heard of Sarah J. Maas? I have, and I've never read it. That's not true. I read Throne of Glass when it came out, which was 2012, and I've never gone back. That's not the point though. The point is, Sarah J. Maas is the most popular author of romantic fantasy, romantasy. I'm just gonna call it romantasy, okay? And the reason her work is specifically romantasy is because while it's set in these fantastical lands and societies, and we have all these fae creatures and other non-human creatures, the main storyline is romance. I didn't mean to sound so disgusted immediately when I talked about romance. Now, it's one thing if you're a customer coming into the store knowing that you want to read one of these 3 series. You know what you're looking for. You'll find it in the fantasy section. It's 16 different shelves of her books, and 7 of those shelves are currently dedicated to House of Flame and Shadow. But what if you don't want to read Sarah J. Maas? You like Romantasy, but you've read everything she's ever written, or maybe you want to read something new that you've never heard of. Yeah, you can read Jennifer L. Armentrout, or you can read Iron Flame, or look for something published by Bloom. But like, that's not enough. I think one of the points of the video that I'm trying to make right now is that fantasy as a genre is far too broad to be put into one section. I've gone into stores before where they don't even have a sci-fi section that's different from fantasy. It's all together, and that's crazy talk. I do genuinely think that Romantasy should have like its own shelves, because that's the next issue, or 2 of the next issues. How do we define what is Romantasy versus what is romance, what is fantasy, what is something else that I haven't thought of? General fiction, I guess. And then also, if a customer is coming into the store knowing they want Romantasy, how are they gonna find it when it's spread out everywhere? And yeah, they're gonna come to me, the employee, and say, hello, I would like to buy some Romantasy. And I will say, okay, let me take you around to all the different shelves and point out individual books and say, that's Romantasy, I think. I think that one's also Romantasy. I've heard that author writes Romantasy, but some of her stuff isn't. And I don't know. And then there are books where they've been pitched to me as Romantasy, and so I sell them that way. But then I'm told by readers and fans that I'm wrong. So who draws the line? What is the definition? Who decides what is Romantasy and what is not? The answer to that is actually the author. This is gonna be like a bit of a side tangent, but there are a lot of instances in, at least in my store, where we have books shelved in certain sections where I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me. So for example, I've talked about this before, but C.J. Cook. C.J. Cook writes general fiction that is definitely horror, and I want it to be in the horror section so badly. I don't know why it's in general fiction, but it's entirely possible that that was her choice to make. An actual example of that happening is Guy Gavriel Kay's books. Now, he writes definitely fantasy books, but he has specifically requested that his books go into general fiction. I don't really know why that is. I think possibly he was writing in a mindset of like, no one takes fantasy seriously. This is totally speculation, but I can see some authors being like, well, I think that fantasy isn't taken seriously, so I want to have my books put into fiction because more people will buy them. And maybe that was true at one point. I don't think it is now, but I definitely think it's true for things like romance and horror, where authors will have their books put into a more popular section because they don't think the genre that their book actually is taken seriously enough by critics and readers. And they want their books to be popular, which is fair. So as for the books that I am under the impression are Romantasy, but then have been told otherwise by readers are, hold on, let me grab them. These guys, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and then separately, they're not together, Hurricane Wars. When I made my whole video about why I bought 3 copies of Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and it was because I'm a collector more than a reader, I referred to these books as Romantasy and mentioned that they have a strong romantic plot line. I had a number of comments telling me that I was absolutely wrong. I think I'm right still. I know that there's other stuff going here. There's dragons and school and politics, rebellion perhaps, but mostly, at least what I hear about, is the romance. And obviously you don't have to have actual romantic intentions to be considered romance. If you're having sexual relations, that's romance when it comes to the book world. And then this one's a bit different, where the author's intention was for this to be Romantasy. This is a Reylo fanfic, so Kylo Ren and Rey from Star Wars. This was originally fan fiction about them, and then it got turned into an actual book with an actual world that apparently is just the Grishaverse. It's being pitched as Romantasy, so I sell it as Romantasy, but then I'm told by readers that it's like not that. But I think those readers also misunderstand what romance is. Like the opposites of these guys, where they think because this is not as spicy, it's not romance, but it still is. I'm getting confused myself, so you're probably confused as well. In my theoretical perfect bookstore where every single subgenre has its own section, where would these go? Would they go in romantasy? Or would they go in fantasy? Or would they go in some other, they go in flying fantasy? Because that's my new subgenre, sky fantasy. And that's only the beginning of my hypothetical problems. Because then we have a section for teen books and children's books. And do I divide those into all the subgenres? Because we certainly don't do that now. All teen books are like one thing for whatever reason. I guess it's because teenagers don't have money, so we don't need to cater to them as much, but all the teen books are mashed together. We've got fantasy, contemporary, horror, anything that's for teenagers or children goes in one section. So stuff like this, do I put it in romantasy or do I keep it in teen? We also have a thing in bookstores where we don't like to separate authors' works into separate sections unless you're Colleen Hoover. Then you can do whatever you want. The most obvious example of this in my store is Stephen King. Now, if you only have basic knowledge of Stephen King, you know he's a horror writer, so you would naturally look for him in the horror section. But he also writes a lot of fantasy and just contemporary fiction that we still have to shelve as horror. And it's dumb. So like Fairy Tale and the Dark Tower series, those you will find in horror. And so now this is bleeding into my romantasy conversation because Bride by Ali Hazelwood just came out. Now, I think this is actually a paranormal romance, or it would be considered a paranormal romance, which I've only been to one store ever that had a paranormal romance section, and my friend Katie was very happy about that. But I think it's set in a fantasy world. Like, it's definitely not just a girl and a werewolf. It's a vampire and a werewolf, and like this is a fantasy, and apparently it's very political. But of course we shelve this in romance because it's Ali Hazelwood. If I were to put this in fantasy or my hypothetical romantasy section, people would not be able to find it and they'd be very confused. Tell me in the comments, fans of romantasy, would you like it if your books had their own section, or would you feel like they were being punished by being kicked out of fantasy? I actually would like to know this. I don't want it to feel like I'm trying to get rid of romantasy books. Although there are other subgenres of fantasy that are far superior. They also deserve their own sections. They're just not as big as romantasy, okay? I'll admit it. I think the takeaway for me from this conversation that I'm having with myself is that I want all types of readers and bookstore customers to feel like seen when they come into a bookstore. There is a store in Greektown in Toronto, I can't remember the name right now, Rereading. It's called Rereading, and it is a sci-fi fantasy store primarily, and because of that, its sections are broken down into the most like finite subgenres, and I adore it. And that's actually the store I was referencing earlier that has a whole paranormal fantasy, or sorry, paranormal romance section. And I wish more stores were like that. Honestly, I can sit here complaining enough about how fantasy isn't broken down into subgenres, but general fiction is actually probably the worst one. That's just everything else that's not fantasy or horror or mystery or a western, I guess. So we have insane mixes of books in the fiction section, from thrillers to romance that's not considered romance for some reason, to important cultural conversations, to silly nonsense. It is ultimately the publishers and the authors themselves that are deciding where the books are shelved. The bookstore has a say in it as well, but the original consultation happens with the publishers. I don't know if it's like business strategy to shelve things in fantasy versus romance when they're really both or neither, but I want a reader to be able to walk into a bookstore and know that what they're looking for is going to be in a defined section surrounded by other books that they're going to like. Someone that doesn't have the knowledge from Book Talk and Bookstagram, or knowing which publishers to look for, what types of covers they need to look for, they should be able to just find book recommendations and be happy. Yeah, and that is my job, to give book recommendations. So I know maybe this is all just me trying to do less work. If I walked into a bookstore and there was a section on weird fiction or hard sci-fi or gothic horror, I would be in heaven. When I started working at the bookstore I'm at right now, we didn't even have a horror section. And I know how I felt about that. I was like, hey, where's my horror? Why is it in the regular fiction section? That's not right. And we've changed that by now. And I just feel like romantasy is becoming such a big genre that the same treatment should happen to it. Now, it's not gonna happen in my store. We're not gonna be the flagship of this movement because we just don't physically have the space. But if we did, I think there are enough people that work with me that are on the same page about this that we could have a romantasy section and other subgenre sections. We could split up teen and kids into actual genres instead of the genre being child. I guess I'm saying if you own a bookstore and have the space and abilities, add more subgenres. Do it. Right now. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on this topic. Do you read romantasy? Do you not care? Did you skip through this video because it's stupid? Before I go, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell icon so you know when I upload new videos. I upload 2 days a week. I love you guys. Goodbye.